One of the greatest gifts my brother gave me was passing me the torch of compassion. I now see him in others and know that the first step with mental illness is compassion. When engaging with mental health, compassion is one of the most useful skills anyone can bring to the table. I mean, many of us have good intentions. When we see someone who's struggling, we want to help. But sometimes it can be difficult for us to connect to others or to understand the situation. I don't know what it's like to be you, and you don't know what it's like to be me. This is where compassion and its cousin empathy come in. Complicated situations and relationships become easier when we take the time and heart to learn and listen. So I bring this up because for today's video, I'll need you to not only feel compassion, but to act upon it. What this means exactly will be explained a bit by the end of the video. So, as the title suggests, this video is about the intersection of mental health and Native identities. Indigenous people have been one of the most exploited groups in American and, frankly, world history. Yet, depending on where you live, you may never even hear about their concerns on the news. So let's do some active education ourselves. Tune into your empathy and compassion and prioritize learning about some of the most important issues that affect the mental health of Indigenous youths today, starting with this video. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful guest speaker today. But before we hear more from our guest speaker, let's lay the groundwork first by looking at the experiences and perspectives of Indigenous mental health. Hello, welcome to this video. Oh, this is the intro. Let's start by looking at some numbers. Now, thanks to a system that ignores and disempowers Indigenous people in the US, many are at higher risk of mental health problems. For example, over the course of a month, Native Americans report 2.5 times more serious psychological distress than an average American. For young people aged 15 to 19, the suicide rate is more than twice that of non-Hispanic white youths. In fact, Natives have the highest suicide rate out of all ethnic groups overall. Now, being Indigenous does not mean that you're inherently more prone to mental illness or distress simply because you are Indigenous. So, what's causing this crisis? Well, the short answer is a continued and continuing history of forced movement, suppressed identities, exploitation, and neglect that form trauma and policies which continue to create barriers for Indigenous health today. But before we look at that history, let's get a few basic questions out of the way. So first things first, who are Native Americans exactly? Well, although they make up less than 2% of the US population today, Indigenous Americans were the first ones on the land currently known as the United States of America. They have both rich and complex histories and represent an incredibly diverse demographic. And when I say diverse, I mean it. Currently, there are 574 federally recognized Native tribes in the US. Here, the term recognition is used in a legal sense, since federal recognition by the US government grants certain benefits and legal protections. So these include the ability for tribe members to govern themselves and their land, and eligibility for some federal programs and services, like subsidized healthcare. Now, side note, stereotypes sometimes frame Native Americans as people who are just freely given healthcare, but actually, healthcare is a historical treaty right between Indigenous nations and the US government. Still, not all tribal nations are recognized by the federal government. Some are recognized only by their respective states. In 2016, there were 63 state-recognized tribes, and unfortunately, state recognition doesn't always guarantee funding from federal or state governments. And because most states today haven't really adopted a formal recognition process, several tribes aren't officially recognized by federal or state governments. This is the case for more than 55 tribes in California alone. But lack of formal recognition doesn't mean a tribe is any less of a real tribe or nation. Every tribal nation has its own identity, history, and customs. And even looking at just language alone, we see about 150 different ones spoken by indigenous people in the US today. And that's compared to an estimated 300 indigenous languages that were once spoken here. Generations of genocide and forced cultural assimilation have played a huge role in the erasure of indigenous language and culture, and it's important to understand this history when we talk about Native identity and mental health. After all, everyone has their own way of engaging with their identity and community. Indigeneity can be racial, cultural, even political. Being Native means different things to different people. So as we go on with the video, keep this in mind. Don't assume that what applies for one person or tribe must be true for all Native people. Instead, let's listen as their stories lead the way. Time for history. And what a story. What a history indeed. From 1776 to 1887, the US took, and in most cases, stole more than 1.5 billion acres of land from indigenous people. That's over 60% of the current US landmass, and this number doesn't even account for the land that was taken outside of that time period. Disease, broken treaties, and forced removals of indigenous people have killed and stripped indigenous people of their ancestral lands for centuries. And if you went to school in the US, you've probably heard some version of this history, from the Trail of Tears to Geronimo to maybe even the indigenous code talkers of the Second World War, many of whom were Navajo. So we'll leave that as further independent study outside of this video. But here I want to talk about what isn't often in history books. What happened after the 1800s, outside of World War II? Well, from 1879 until the mid-1900s, many indigenous children were forcibly sent to government or church-run boarding schools, often thousands of miles away from their homes. The goal of these schools was to Christianize the indigenous population, and so they often forced indigenous children to completely abandon their traditional cultures. The Carrizo School's founder famously said the quote, "Kill the Indian and save the man." Generations of indigenous youths grew up without family role models, and many were sexually and physically abused. The overall quality of education was not good, to say the least. In fact, the whole boarding school model was based off of a program that was first tested on Apache prisoners of war. Overall, the schools had a lasting impact on the education levels and socioeconomic status for generations of natives, which many continue to experience today. One such impact is socioeconomics. Out of all minorities in the United States, indigenous people experience the highest poverty rate and are especially vulnerable to factors like homelessness. Given history, this sadly isn't surprising. When your land is stolen and you are forcefully removed from your family to be educated, it's difficult to accumulate wealth for future generations, to say the least. Wealth, by the way, is a family's net worth, including things like a home, a savings account, or stocks. Having wealth makes you more financially secure, and wealth generates more wealth. So when you're centuries behind from the starting line, you get the picture. Poverty can have very real implications for mental health. According to the World Health Organization, socioeconomic conditions are one of the most powerful factors that increase a person's risk of experiencing a mental illness. This can be because of a number of factors associated with poverty, like higher stress levels and food or housing insecurity. Of course, our socioeconomic status doesn't define us, but being aware of these risk factors can be important when it comes to getting the help that we may need. Now, where you live is yet another risk factor when it comes to your mental and, well, physical health as well. Your neighborhood determines the resources and education that you can access, but that's not all. Your zip code also ties into environmental racism, particularly here in the US. Environmental racism is a form of systemic racism that exposes Black, Indigenous, and people of color to environmental hazards more so than others. This has existed long throughout history, but for the sake of time, we'll only go into a few examples. Here's one. During the Cold War, several mining companies opened uranium mines and mills on indigenous land without informing the native communities that were living there about the known health risks of uranium and radiation. Many indigenous people were hired as often underpaid workers, treated as test subjects, and forced to work in dangerous conditions without proper protective gear. Not surprisingly, exposure to uranium and radiation caused a host of health problems, like bone cancer, kidney damage, and lung cancer, to say the least. The impact is still felt today because of other related consequences, like soil and water contamination. Now, another example is something you might have heard of, the Dakota Access Pipeline, meant to transport shale oil from North Dakota to Illinois. The project was publicly announced in 2014, but by 2016 and 2017 gained mass attention as thousands of protesters, led by indigenous efforts, lined up to physically block the construction despite facing violent responses from the police. Never mind the environmental damages of oil usage and the potential for catastrophic oil spills, protesters pointed out that the original route for the pipeline was supposed to go near Bismarck, a predominantly white city. After complaints about the pipeline potentially contaminating drinking water for that city's residents, the route got moved to near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, an over-sacred burial ground. Moving the pipeline doesn't just magically get rid of the environmental contamination problem. So yeah, this is a pretty blatant case of environmental racism. Thanks to indigenous activists, the Obama administration rejected permits for the pipeline. But the current Trump administration reversed course and allowed the pipeline to be built. Projects like these are especially devastating for indigenous communities who have developed close ties to their land for practical and spiritual reasons. But these types of problems aren't actually the biggest threat. There's a scarier force that will hurt indigenous land and communities for generations to come. Yeah, we're talking about climate change. Now, it's no secret that rising temperatures pose a threat to everyone who lives on this planet, but it might be less obvious why climate change is especially dangerous for indigenous communities. So part of this has to do with geographic location. Climate change is especially urgent for Arctic and Alaska natives because the Arctic region warms at 2 to 3 times the global average rate. And for many indigenous people, a strong emotional or spiritual connection with ancestral land is crucial. For example, some Inuit natives have associated pollution of their land with their community's mental health. In coastal communities, heavy rain caused by climate change can lead to flooding, which often forces the people who live there to relocate. And relocating is stressful business to begin with, but for indigenous people, relocating can be a reminder of the trauma associated with colonization. Now, on a more social level, climate change can make indigenous oral traditions and stories more difficult to relate to for the present and future generations. This is because with climate change comes changes in things like animal behavior, species abundance, even the way a sacred waterway flows. Strong oral traditions tie communities together in a really powerful way. So when stories become less understandable, it can be harder for natives to feel secure in their identities. All of this can contribute to feelings of spiritual connectivity and loss, which can negatively impact mental health. It's important to note that these are legitimate issues, and that getting support as well as doing our part, all of us, in fighting climate change can be helpful ways to cope. But if you're still not sure just how much losing touch with your traditions and community can impact your mental health, well, we don't have to wait generations to find out. Let's turn to the present-day foster care system. For decades, Indigenous children have been overrepresented in the foster care system. Now, when we say they're overrepresented, it means that we see a higher proportion of Indigenous children in the foster care system compared to the rest of the population. So in states like South Dakota, where indigenous children make up less than 15% of all children in the state, we see that they make up over half of all children in the foster care system. This isn't a recent development. Before 1978, 25 to 35% of indigenous children were separated from their families by state and private adoption agencies. Since then, the US government has made some changes, like passing the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. The goal in passing it was to keep indigenous children with their families and tribes. But over 30 states today are not following the law. This is partly because many have a financial incentive not to. For every child put into foster care by being removed from their family, the state can actually receive thousands of dollars from the federal government, sometimes even higher amounts if that child is indigenous. Now, you might think that these kids maybe just don't have family members to stay with, so that's why they ended up in foster care. But oftentimes, indigenous children are placed outside of their families, even when a relative or tribe member is available and ready to take custody. Now, this matters because having a strong cultural identity can be a really powerful protective factor for mental health. And being pulled away from all that through the foster care system doesn't help. Given that over 80% of foster children in the US have a significant mental health concern, this can be especially distressing. But actually, children in foster care don't account for all disappearances in indigenous communities. Indigenous girls and women disappear at twice the rate of white Americans, and on some tribal lands, they are murdered at 10 times the national average. In many cases, these disappearances are not tracked by the US Department of Justice, and getting police support can be difficult. So this can lead to mistrust with emergency services in the event of a mental health emergency and creates a very real feeling of fear and worry for many indigenous families. But while what I just described can be linked to mental health stressors pretty easily, there are factors that impact indigenous mental health that are a bit more subtle. So for example, recent studies in epigenetics show that historical trauma can actually be passed down from generation to generation to literally change our biology. So given all that indigenous people have gone through in this country, there's a lot of stress-related behavior and emotion that can cross generations to affect mental health today. This doesn't mean that you're bound to have a mental illness because of your parents' or grandparents' trauma, but it does mean that it might be important for you to seek support more so than others. Remember, it's not a doomed sentence. It's simply something to be informed about so that we can make the best and healthiest decisions for ourselves. And unfortunately, it's not just trauma that's potentially inheritable. Natives also have the highest rate out of all ethnic groups for alcohol and substance abuse. This matters because alcohol and substance abuse can increase the likelihood of someone experiencing a mental illness and vice versa. Now, keep in mind, this is definitely not to say that all indigenous people are going to develop a substance abuse problem. I mean, statistics really don't tell the whole story. In fact, Native Americans are actually more likely than all other racial demographics to believe that they would benefit from treatment and to actively seek help. So it's important to note that I say all this not to pass on a message of despair, but rather to point out the very real protective factors that Natives have honed throughout history. What's inheritable is not just risk factors, but the power to overcome them as well. But with all that said, how do you really seek help in a way that's accessible and effective? Well, okay, it's easy to say just go to the doctor, but there can be real barriers to receiving quality treatment. This is especially the case when it comes to mental health care. First, there's the issue of federal recognition. Members of federally recognized tribes are eligible for services provided by the Indian Health Service, or IHS, but accessing affordable healthcare can be challenging for members of non-recognized tribes. And even for those who can access the IHS, many have good reasons to mistrust and avoid it. I mean, in the 1960s and 1970s, the IHS forcefully sterilized 1 in 4 Native American women without their consent. because doctors didn't believe Native women were intelligent enough to understand birth control. Now, I'm just going to point out here that this sounds like eugenics to me, honestly, and I would not want to deal with a system that has that history with my people. So understandable that many indigenous people choose to not trust the IHS. But there aren't really that many choices, especially for those who are living in poverty or on reservations. And even for people who do use the IHS, there are other serious concerns as well. For example, the IHS is hugely underfunded. Per person, the IHS spends less than half the national average on healthcare services. In addition, the IHS mainly serves those on reservations. And given that more than 2/3 of natives live outside of reservations, this can make accessing affordable healthcare especially difficult. Now, outside of the IHS, treatment may depend on your insurance. In 2017, roughly half of Indigenous Americans used private health insurance, compared to 75% of non-Hispanic white Americans. 43% of natives relied on Medicaid or other public plans, and 15% had no insurance coverage. Luckily, some mental health centers offer a pay-as-you-can scale called a sliding scale, which can help a bit with the costs of treatment. You can use an online lookup tool to help you find a center that fits those and other needs. Here's one, for example. And if you do have health insurance, but just don't know what you can use it for, you can usually look up your benefits online or call your insurance company to see what's covered and how much you might have to pay. Other programs like Title VI can also support Indigenous youths and their mental well-being. But now here's the kicker. They often require proof of tribal enrollment. And this is where we run into another roadblock. Enrolling in a tribe is often trickier than it sounds, since in the US, Indigenous people are the only group required to prove their identity. Natives have to receive a Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood, or CDIB, to prove their Indigenous quote-unquote blood quantum, which measures a person's Native ancestry. In order to enroll in a tribe, Indigenous people have to meet specific blood quantum requirements. Now, looking back on history, violence against Indigenous people and the sterilization of Native women have meant that many families chose to hide their identities for their own safety. Now, while completely understandable, these decisions can make it difficult for people of this generation today to meet blood quantum requirements. So even though different tribes have different blood quantum requirements, things like having mixed ancestry or having to hide one's identity and losing family records can mean that many Indigenous people fall just short of being eligible of these programs that are supposed to help them. But the issue of a forced blood quantum requirement isn't just logistical, it's also psychological. It can create this feeling of never being Native enough. Maybe anytime you're sure that you're Indigenous, the response you get is, but how much of you is? Feeling like you have to justify or prove your identity to other people can be, well, exhausting. Now, we're here to say that you're not half of a person, 1/4 of a person, or 1/8. You are a whole person. People spend entire lifetimes figuring out who they are. You are allowed time to navigate your identity too. So learn the culture, study the history, but most importantly, give yourself permission to explore your identity however you feel comfortable. And if you're not sure where to begin healing the wounds and questions left behind by your identity and the history that comes with it, don't fret. We can start by exploring it together. Well, one powerful protective factor for many Indigenous people is their traditions and cultures. Despite a history of oppression, violence, and loss, Natives have carved out narratives of strength and resilience and community. Now, to be clear, not everyone will be able to benefit from this. Because of history and other barriers, some Indigenous communities lack essential resources in a way that's deeply felt by everyone. So when a tragedy like suicide happens, others in the community might identify strongly with the person who died and consider taking their own life as well. This is what we call cluster suicides. Now, obviously, that's extremely distressing. And of course, those who are taken into foster care, abducted, or even simply moved far away from their loved ones to seek better opportunities may be isolated from community protection as well. So, we're going to talk about the healing process. But keep in mind that not everything will be able to apply to everyone, especially given how diverse Indigenous communities are in their beliefs and practices. Now, what are some of the ways Indigenous cultures and communities can promote healing? Well, in general, many traditional practices can create moments of harmony and community. These could include things like the powwow, music, birdsong, sweat lodge, smudging practices, or dance. Large group spiritual activities can be especially powerful because, well, they build extensive support networks and can serve as a culturally acceptable way for Indigenous people to express their feelings. Rituals of spirituality and prayer can also encourage healing by promoting resilience and strength. For example, take the concept of the Whipper Man from Plateau tribes, an esteemed non-parental figure in the tribe who helps discipline the youth. Now, this can be adopted in modern-day scenarios to help maintain a positive role model in the community and also establish a sense of connectedness and trust. Or take going on a vision quest, which is a rite of passage for young natives in some tribes. This can help with deciphering one's role and purpose in life. Yet another example is the Pan-Indian concept of the Red Road, or the Native American pathway to spirituality. This concept can be interpreted differently by different people, but generally it looks at the way a person gets on and stays on the road, like an approach to how to live your life righteously and spiritually. Now, this can include practices like prayer or attending tribal ceremonies, which can help a person lead a more compassionate and fulfilling life. While the Red Road can be a guide for many parts of life, we especially see Indigenous people use it to maintain sobriety by turning back to things like tribal medicines and away from alcohol and substance abuse. These concepts vary from tribe to tribe, of course, but a key point is that Native youths can try turning to the community or identity that helps them feel less alone or lost. And on that note, community can also be found online, and we've linked some resources in the description below for how you can find them. Connectedness to nature can also promote mental well-being. Waking up before the sun, exploring the land, these are simple but protective factors too. Staying active one way or another is just a good idea in general, so it's worth your time to find a physical activity that you enjoy. Alternative and traditional medicine, spiritual healers, and medicine men can also promote healing. These methods can help reinforce one's sense of identity, but they're also a source of culturally competent healing. This is important because Western mental health care providers might not always understand cultural nuances. Indigenous people sometimes experience distress in ways that aren't diagnosed using Western standards. This might include things like ghost sickness, wakinto, or heartbreak syndrome. On the flip side, things like hearing spirits, which might be completely normal in some Indigenous cultures, could be misdiagnosed as schizophrenia by a Western psychologist. And then there's language differences to consider. In fact, some tribal languages don't have a word for depression or anxiety. So when you ask, what's wrong, you might get a whole story back. Now, storytelling is a way of healing. And when it's done properly, storying can incorporate Native spirituality into the healing process by allowing a person to shape their narrative with mythology or other traditional tales. It sounds a bit like talk therapy in a way, but there are elements to it that won't be present in an average therapy session unless you work with someone who's culturally trained. So if that's not your cup of tea, consider other non-native healing practices that are maybe more in tune with spirituality than the sort of typical Western treatment, like water release therapy. What is yet another factor that can promote your well-being? Food. Yes, you heard me correctly. Eating traditional foods can be beneficial for your mental and physical health. Given that the health of our mind and body are interconnected, This is like two birds with one stone. After all, eating traditional foods can help with cardiovascular and nutritional health, and preparing them can actually help reinforce cultural pride as well. In fact, from the 1980s to the 2000s, the Alaskan tribal village of Kake found that teaching indigenous youth how to prepare traditional foods reduced suicide dramatically. And that's really powerful as well as delicious. Now, with all that said, sometimes indigenous-based or related approaches to healing might not always be enough. And if that's the case, you might also turn to Western treatments or medication. And when used together correctly, these types of methods, Western and indigenous, might become even more effective. If you do go this route, though, it's important to be honest with your healthcare provider about all that you're taking and using, because some Western psychiatric medications can have dangerous drug interactions with traditional medicines. So be safe. And of course, as a side note, whenever we say Western here, we're talking about things from a colonized perspective. So don't take it literally as a geographic connotation, and more as a sort of ramification and aftermath of what happened after the colonizers came to the Americas. Now, with that said, seeking Western quote-unquote treatment is of course not as easy as it sounds. To fully benefit from it, it's important to seek out culturally competent healthcare providers. But given that fewer than 50 psychiatrists in the US identify as indigenous today, doing so requires some serious effort and research. So take the time and get some friends or family to help you choose a provider and type of therapy that you feel most comfortable with. You can ask your community members for their recommendations if they've received treatment before. And you can also check the websites of indigenous cultural organizations for a referral. When you're looking for a provider who will suit your needs, here are some questions that you can ask them just to make sure. Sometimes you'll find the perfect treatment right away, but other times you might need to try again and again. And if that's the case, I know it's hard, but don't give up. Natives have proven time and time again that being a fighter and a learner is in the blood, and healing is far from impossible. Being indigenous in America undoubtedly comes with its challenges, but Native communities have built resilience and strength for centuries. So tap into that. It's a part of you that no one can ever take away.
Hello, Yat My name is Sean Ray. I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm a first-generation Afro-Indigenous student studying electrical engineering at Oklahoma State University. And so I have 3 points that I think will help. Number one, it's okay to not know something. Something that's helped me with pushing through the realm of mental health is just taking it one topic at a time and slowly learning things step by step. And not only that, but just starting with your own mental health. Learning about the material with somebody else can make a huge difference in how you learn it and how you understand the material. Number two, be selfish. So a large part of learning about your own mental health is prioritizing your mental health needs and what you need to get through and what you need to learn. Taking care of yourself has to be the first step in taking care of others, because if you're not up to mental, physical health, then it can be very difficult to try and help others. And I learned that the hard way. Number three, you're not alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. And so the thing that I've learned about mental health is that a lot of people struggle with very common things. And so being completely open and honest and just really transparent about how you're feeling, what you're going through, what you're learning, and the learning process too, that can help immensely. And unfortunately, people have different stigmas of mental health. Everybody has their own learning experience with mental health. And so taking the time and the patience to really talk about it with somebody that you know and trust could be a process. So don't get discouraged, because just talking about it and being open is one step closer to learning about more mental health in general and just helping your own mental health in that process. Learning about your own mental health and mental health in general is a lifelong process. Always remember that you're amazing, you're the future, you can learn anything, you can do anything, and don't let anybody ever tell you any different. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Before you go, I want you to think back to the importance of compassion and empathy that I mentioned at the start of this video. Because so many Indigenous issues don't make their ways onto national news, let's take the time to actively seek out opportunities to utilize our empathy and support Indigenous voices. One way to do so right now is to look at what's happening in Tongass. The Tongass National Forest, located in southeastern Alaska, is the largest forest in the US and stores the most carbon out of all carbon sinks in the US. It's been home to the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian Nation for centuries. Given what we've discussed about environmental racism and the impacts of climate change, especially on Indigenous populations, this is pretty freaking important. But the Trump administration is trying to open the Tongass up for economic gain through industrial logging and development. So please, take a few minutes today to call or write to your representatives. Talk to the US Forest Service. Links on how to do so and more information will all be put in the description down below. Like most issues that we need to tackle today, this won't be enough. But it is a start. And the first step is where change happens.